Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So you've sent us a really fascinating stack of sources today, and they all seem to circle around this profound and honestly kind of unsettling observation about the modern world.
It is unsettling.
It's this idea that the very nature of power, of influence, is quietly changing. We're not talking about, the formal stuff, elections, laws, that kind of thing.
No, not at all. It's something deeper. It's about the underlying consensus, the fundamental atmosphere of society itself, that invisible current that dictates everything else.
Right, and it's a feeling I think a lot of us have, intuitively, this pervasive sense that politics isn't going away. Of course not. We still have governments, laws are still passed.
Power is still executed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's no longer at the vanguard. It feels like it's become this reactive force. It's following something else, not leading.
That's the perfect way to put it. It's following. And that's the strange feeling of the age, isn't it? The feeling that the people in charge aren't really in charge of the direction anymore.
Which is where our sources jump right in. They bring up this core question, often attributed to the philosopher Albert Camus, which is it's so sharp. It asks, who is deciding the moral and emotional atmosphere that politics is now forced to breathe in?
Because that atmosphere is everything. It dictates what's seen as acceptable, what's suddenly unspeakable, what's urgent, what's a priority.
And if you look at how modern life is structured, the sources are just crystal clear on the answer. It's not your parliament. It's definitely not your constitution.
And it's certainly not some long, dusty legal text. It's culture. It's the living, breathing, moment-to-moment environment of repeated stories, of the images we share every day.
The instant consensus that forms on social media right now. A viral phrase, a meme.
Exactly. That collective agreement that suddenly defines what's normal, or what's suddenly outrageous, or even what we're supposed to find funny. That's where the agenda is being set now.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to explore this profound idea of an existential inversion. We'll try to analyze why we, as a society, sort of collectively stopped trusting politics to be the ultimate source of meaning.
And how culture, almost by default, stepped into that vacuum to take the lead.
And then we have to look at the implications, because they're subtle, but they could be dangerous for things like long-term governance and maybe most importantly, for the quiet, enduring nature of our own individual responsibility.
Let's do it. Let's really unpack this shift in the mechanics of power and try to understand why this relationship between the government and the governed feels like it's been flipped completely on its head.
Okay, so let's start with defining this tectonic shift. The sources call it the existential inversion, which is a heavy term, but the idea is actually pretty simple, right?
It is. The old model, let's say, for most of the last century, was that politics tried to impose meaning and order first. It had a grand vision, and its goal was to shape people to fit that vision.
It tried to create the new man.
The new man, the new society, exactly. It was proactive. Now that's flipped. Politics has become the ultimate reactive force. It doesn't shape people first. It reacts to how people already are later.
And that's such a fundamental difference in attitude. I mean, if you rewind to the early 20th century, that political impulse, and this was across the board, from totalitarian ideologies to even these huge, large-scale democratic projects, the goal was always creative.
It was always about building something new, a defined, often utopian future based on these colossal collective projects.
And Camus was right there, watching what those absolute promises actually did in the real world. He saw firsthand that when you take these abstract ideals, things like, historical inevitability or collective justice,
grand concepts,
and you give them supreme power, they invariably end up crushing actual, concrete, specific human beings who just don't happen to fit into the grand scheme.
Precisely. And that history, that experience, created a deep, deep skepticism that we've inherited. People learned a very difficult lesson from the 20th century.
Which is?
That the attempt by politics to define ultimate meaning often results in the destruction of real, individual, human meaning. And because of that, people they don't look to the political sphere anymore for their life's purpose. They're looking somewhere else.
And that somewhere else is culture. But let's be specific here, because the sources are really clear on this point. This isn't high culture in the classical sense.
No, we're not talking about going to the opera or reading classic novels, as wonderful as those things are. This is living culture.
What does that mean exactly?
It's the immediate shared stuff. The streaming shows everyone is talking about, the music that defines a moment, the endless scroll of social media discourse. It's the slang we use every day, the little repeated symbols and memes that form the instinctive moral reflexes of a generation.
So it's the stuff we're swimming in.
We're swimming in it. And what people are seeking in this living culture isn't a new set of laws. It's something much more fundamental. They're seeking the sense that they live in a world they can actually understand.
That's a powerful idea.
It's a core insight from Camus. He believed one of the deepest human needs is for comprehension. We can endure almost any suffering as long as we can grasp the reason for it, or at least understand the mechanism of what's happening to us.
And that explains perfectly why politics is failing at this today. It is, by its very design, just too slow.
Far too slow.
It's built for deliberation, for committees, for compromise, which makes it feel abstract and just so far removed from the immediate, messy, emotionally charged reality of our daily lives.
While culture, by contrast, has this incredible velocity, it moves at the speed of an idea, not a bureaucracy. It slips into every small decision, every momentary impulse, every shared frustration or burst of joy.
One of our sources used a great analogy. It's the difference between a giant, slow-turning battleship.
And a swarm of highly motivated jet skis.
Right. A joke, a meme, a viral narrative. It spreads faster and sinks in deeper than any law ever could. A single controversial symbol or specific hashtag can be infinitely more potent right now than a formal congressional resolution.
Oh, absolutely. A cultural trend, if it gets enough validation from the crowd, can force the entire political world to change its tone, often in less than 24 hours.
And this is where that core paradox starts to emerge.
Yeah.
It's not that culture is, objectively stronger than formal political power. A state can still command an army.
Of course. But power, if it wants to be stable, if it wants to endure, it needs consent. It needs the acceptance of the people it governs. And today, that acceptance is born, it's nurtured, and it's validated entirely in the cultural sphere.
So if politics fails to speak the language of that accepted culture,
it loses its legitimacy. It loses its ability to function, let alone to survive. It becomes alienating.
So here's where it gets really fascinating, because the sources lay out this ultimate existential punchline. Politics still decides our material fate. It passes the laws that set our tax rates, that start or end wars, that define our border.
All the big structural stuff.
All the big stuff. But, and this is the inversion, it no longer decides how we feel about that fate.
That emotional framework, that moral lens through which we view our reality, is now dictated entirely by culture. Culture defines what makes us angry, what deserves public shame, what needs to be protected, and maybe, most crucially, where we get our sense of belonging.
So if politics tries to impose a rule or a policy that just fundamentally clashes with that culturally established emotional climate,
it's dead on arrival. Even if it's legally binding, the backlash will make it unenforceable. The cultural rejection neuters the political power.
And that brings us right back to that dangerous question.
Yeah.
If politics is now waiting for cultural permission before it can act, who is truly leading whom?
The answer is this silent, radical change happening right under the surface of our constitutional lives. Power no longer imposes meaning from the top down. It has to go out and actively seek the meaning that's already present in cultural life.
A meaning that was created, ironically, not to rule or to control anyone,
but just to help people endure the absurdity and the difficulty of their daily lives. It's a coping mechanism that's become a command structure.
And Camus saw the tragedy in this for the political class. Politics needs consistency, it needs a long-term perspective, it needs to be slow.
Yet it's being dragged into this cultural sphere where emotions are completely volatile, symbols are ephemeral, and our collective memory is measured in days, not decades. The political class isn't setting the pace anymore. They're just running desperately to keep up with a restless public that has absolutely no patience for delay.
So in the end, this isn't about politics disappearing. It's about its profound humbling. It's lost the right to define the future. It has to learn how to get in line and listen to the stories that culture has already finished telling. Okay, so that structural shift, that inversion, it naturally leads to the next big question. Why? Why did this retreat happen? Why did people collectively stop looking to politics as the source of, existential meaning?
And the sources here offer a really challenging thesis. It's not, as many people assume, born out of apathy. It's not that people just stopped caring.
It's the opposite, isn't it?
It's the complete opposite. It was born out of a deeply, deeply disappointed belief. When people today say they're tired of politics, Camists would argue they aren't tired because they don't care. They're exhausted because they once cared too much.
And the promises failed them.
Failed them spectacularly. The entire 20th century was just this parade of colossal political projects. Promises of total order, absolute justice, utopia on earth, all demanding immense sacrifice in the present for some clearly defined, perfect future.
And as we touched on, the historical outcome was almost always tragic. The moment these beautiful, abstract political ideals, the will of the people, historical destiny,
were given supreme power, they started to systematically erase the concrete, messy, unique reality of individual lives. The idealism in theory became cold and crushing in practice.
So there's this inherited skepticism we all carry now.
A profound one. People no longer seek their ultimate meaning in these big political structures. They've realized that laws are designed to answer questions of order. How does traffic flow? How are contracts enforced?
Practical stuff.
The practical stuff. But meaning, the deep philosophical answer to why am I here or what is my purpose, that's just not something that can be born from order.
Meaning comes from what? Lived experience.
From understood lived experience. That's the key. It's the feeling that your singular specific pain is seen. That your existence isn't just dissolved or forgotten inside some vague, empty political slogan.
Slogans like "for the common good" or "in the national interest."
Exactly. Those phrases can feel incredibly hollow when you're the one who is hurting. And this brings us to a crucial concept the sources highlight: the coldness of large structures.
And we need to be clear, this coldness isn't necessarily malice, right? It's not that the system is evil.
Not at all. It's just that political systems, by their very nature, have to speak the language of the collective. Bureaucracy, law, policy, they have to generalize. They have to abstract individual cases into categories so the law can be applied universally and fairly.
I think that's a really vital point for listeners. Politics has to ignore nuance to create a universal standard. If the law cared about the specific emotional history of every single person, it would cease to be law. It would just be chaos.
Right. But the individual, in their moment of suffering or joy, feels that coldness so deeply. We hurt, we mourn, we celebrate in the highly specific language of the individual.
And that gap, the gap between the collective language of power and the individual language of suffering, has become, in our modern age, seemingly unbridgeable.
It really has. When politics talks about common interests, the person in pain just hears vagueness. When it talks about long-term direction, they hear procrastination. They hear a minimization of their current pain.
And Camus observed something really powerful here. He said that while we can't endure absolute meaninglessness, what we endure even less is meaninglessness that's meticulously wrapped in beautiful, abstract political rhetoric.
Because that makes the void feel like a betrayal.
So what happens then? What do people do?
They quietly withdraw. It's not a violent revolution. It's a silent, profound existential retreat. They stop submitting their deepest beliefs and their questions of purpose to the political arena.
And that's the open invitation for culture to step in.
Precisely. Culture serves as a refuge. It's not trying to be an organized political rival. The key difference is that culture makes no sweeping promises about a utopian future. Instead, it just reflects the immediate, messy, contradictory present.
Think about the practical effect of that. A viral film that shines a light on a specific social struggle, or a really powerful song. It might solve exactly zero political problems.
It solves nothing in a practical sense, but it provides that critical, immediate feeling that politics struggles to deliver, the moment of existential recognition.
Someone is seeing what I'm feeling.
I am not alone in this. That moment is the true source of cultural power. Camus knew that people can endure almost anything if their suffering is correctly named. But politics is so constrained, it has to be neutral, procedural, balanced. It often sanitizes individual pain to make it palatable for a collective discussion.
Whereas culture has no such rules.
None at all. It can be extreme, emotional, deeply personal, and contradictory all at once. And because of that freedom, it just feels infinitely closer to the raw, visceral experience of being alive. It's messy, but its honesty is compelling.
So the ultimate drive here isn't for political power, it's not for legislative change.
No, it's for existential recognition, the urgent human need to feel that you exist, that your intense emotions aren't just an isolated anomaly, and that your life is more than just a data point in some national statistical model.
And when politics fails to provide that, it forfeits its role as the meaning maker.
It has to. We can't really blame politics. It's a structure, not a source of genuine relationship, but we have to recognize the consequence. Meaning has found a new home.
And that new home, that refuge, is the living culture that's created daily by people with actual lived experience, not by people with formal power. Okay, so let's shift from the why, this philosophical retreat from politics, to the how. How does culture actually exert this incredible power over the formal political structure?
Right, the mechanics of it. And our sources are clear that Camus would be quick to dismiss the easy answers, things like conspiracy theories or some kind of grand cultural manipulation.
It's not that tidy.
No, he described a much simpler, more fundamental, almost systemic mechanism. And it's all based on survival.
Survival.
The survival of the political system itself. Politics, as a way of governing, simply cannot function. It can't operate effectively in a moral or emotional atmosphere that it doesn't control. And culture is now the sole proprietor of that atmosphere.
So culture sets the limits.
It dictates the limits. And these limits are not written down in any law, but they are absolutely binding. Culture determines what you can say publicly without facing immediate career-ending dismissal.
It determines what angers the collective quickly enough to demand an immediate political response.
And, most crucially, it defines what becomes completely unacceptable, the new taboo long before any law has been written to formalize that taboo.
So politics isn't creating this anger or shame or sense of offense.
No, it only reads it. The sources really stress that distinction. They call the modern political process a great reactive reader of public sentiment. And reading is, by definition, a reaction. It is the opposite of guidance.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure, think of a cultural symbol. It could be the name of a building, a corporate logo, a historical statue. If that symbol suddenly changes its meaning in the public mind, if it acquires a powerful negative association almost overnight.
Politics is forced to change its tune instantly.
Instantly. And they change, not because the policymakers have had some sudden, genuine ideological conversion,
But because they need to survive.
it's pure, pragmatic self-preservation within the new, established emotional climate. To resist is to become irrelevant or worse, a target.
The power hasn't vanished. It's transformed. It's learned to speak a new language.
Exactly. It now communicates through the cultural medium, through short emotional triggers, through viral images, through these sharp declarative statements that are designed to bypass thoughtful consideration and aim directly for an emotional reflex.
And this creates that bitter paradox we see every single day. The political machine, which was designed for long-term strategic thinking, for balancing budgets over decades, for multi-year infrastructure plans,
is now forced to operate entirely within a cultural space where emotional cycles are measured in hours, and consensus can reverse on a dime. The long term becomes practically impossible to even discuss.
This mechanism is really visible in what the sources call the limit of discussability.
That invisible shifting boundary.
Right. What must a CEO publicly apologize for this week? What historical figure has to be silenced? What topic can a journalist no longer touch without facing a massive backlash?
And politics just faithfully follows that boundary. It formalizes it, eventually, through new laws, new HR regulations, carefully worded official speeches.
The motivation isn't even that culture is necessarily morally right in its judgment.
No, it's simply that culture got there first. It achieved consensus and passed judgment before politics could even convene a committee to study the issue.
And that leads to this really incisive question. If something has already become culturally unspeakable, what power does a politician actually have left?
Very little. If the collective mood has already hardened into a moral certainty, the only remaining role for the formal political structure is to provide the official rubber stamp. It's formalization, not leadership.
So this goes beyond just a moral judgment and becomes an existential reality for power. Power no longer controls the emotional landscape of its citizens. Its only goal is to survive within the existing climate.
And this is where the profound danger lies. Because these emotions, once they become standardized in the cultural sphere, once there's widespread, unquestioned agreement on what constitutes offense or outrage, they become an unwritten, binding law.
And that cultural law is far stronger and more immediately enforceable than any actual legal text.
Oh, much stronger. A legal law requires a trial, due process, evidence. A cultural law requires only instant consensus and collective digital shaming to be enforced.
The chilling punchline here is that culture may not hold the formal constitutional power, but it dictates the very atmosphere that all power must breathe in order to live. The one who determines the atmosphere is always, in the end, the one who leads.
Which explains perfectly why so many political leaders today look perpetually late to the party, exhausted, and just desperately trying to play catch-up with a conversation that's already miles ahead of them.
Let's shift our focus now from the big mechanisms of power to the individual, to the person living under this inverted order. I mean, Keynes would always bring it back to this, right? How does the individual feel when they're governed by laws, but their meaning comes from memes?
And the sources identify this as the defining existential state of our time. We live in politics. Its laws and decisions regulate our lives. That's unavoidable. But we no longer live with politics.
It's receded.
It's become a distant, impersonal backdrop. Kind of like the weather, it affects you, but you don't feel a deep personal connection to it. Culture, meanwhile, has moved right into the immediate foreground. It's center stage.
And when people feel that their specific personal experience is rendered invisible by the generalized, abstract language of formal power, they'll just aggressively seek visibilities somewhere else.
And culture provides that visibility instantly. It doesn't have to be factually perfect or ideologically consistent. It just has to be emotionally touching and instantly relatable.
The efficiency is incredible when you think about it. A character in a streaming series can articulate a feeling of injustice or alienation more powerfully in 2 minutes.
How the politician can in an hour-long policy speech. A viral movement lets you feel like you belong without the difficult, complicated work of having to formally agree to a whole platform or ideology.
A simple symbol lets you express your anger immediately, without needing to fully understand the complexities of the underlying policy or the long-term consequences of that anger.
And this rapid emotional gratification, it triggers a critical existential shift that Camus noticed a long time ago. People stop seeking the difficulty of order and start seeking the ease of knowing which side they stand on.
And that distinction is everything, isn't it?
It is the whole game. Standing in political order requires extreme patience. It means you have to accept institutional slowness, inevitable contradictions, the delayed gratification of outcomes that might take years to materialize. It's intellectually hard, and it demands that you live with moral ambiguity.
But standing on a side? That's profoundly easy.
It's a huge relief. It grants immediate, satisfying moral clarity. It gives you an instant identity. It simplifies a complex world into a clear binary. There's the side you belong to, and there's the clear adversary that you can instantly define yourself against.
And culture is built for that. Politics, which has to compromise and balance all these competing interests, is terrible at providing that kind of instant identity.
So to survive, politics has to borrow these ready-made, emotionally charged identities that culture is so successfully generating.
This borrowing is what Camus called the emotional dependency of power.
That's it. If political structures can't generate a genuine, durable sense of shared purpose from within, they are forced to borrow the language of emotion and identity that culture is producing so effectively.
What's the consequence of that for the individual, for you, the listener?
The sources call it the fragmented political self. You stop feeling like a citizen in that historical, enduring sense, the person who accepts the burden of complexity. You become a cultural participant.
You interact with the public sphere primarily through symbols, through emotional language, through sharp, short declarations.
The native language of viral culture. And people still care deeply about right and wrong. That hasn't changed. But they're profoundly impatient with the process of finding it.
Politics, with its deliberation and slowness, feels alienating. Culture, with its instantaneous feedback loops, the likes, the shares, the quick validation from your group, it provides immediate relief from that existential tension.
But that relief comes with a quiet, devastating tragedy. The cultural feeling of belonging is inherently unstable. It's not durable like historical political responsibility.
It requires continuous daily reactivation.
Exactly. It depends entirely on the immediate consensus of the crowd, and it fades the moment the symbol changes or the trend shifts.
Camus had a name for this: belonging without memory.
It's a haunting phrase, isn't it? You belong to a movement or a moment, but you have no deep loyalty to it because, subconsciously that it might change tomorrow. You feel absolutely certain about your moral position right now, but you're also acutely aware that the moral ground beneath your feet could shift dramatically when the cultural weather changes.
And that instability creates this new, unique state of being: moral anxiety.
And let's be clear what that is. It's not the anxiety of not knowing what's right. It's the constant, exhausting anxiety that the definition of what is right is perpetually being redrawn, not by any enduring principle, but by the ephemeral cultural climate.
So in that kind of volatile climate, politics can't possibly lead.
It's reduced to being a mere temperature regulator. It's just desperately trying to keep the collective emotional temperature from swinging too wildly between boiling rage and total disillusionment.
And that's where the whole system loses its resilience. When we as individuals seek meaning only in immediate reaction and belonging, we lose the capacity to endure the complexity and contradiction that the truth always carries.
We lose the patience required for genuine political life, which is always, always about the slow, painful work of balancing irreconcilable goods. The ultimate consequence is that we learn to live by reaction, the satisfying, immediate expression of feeling, instead of by responsibility, the willingness to bear the long-term cost of that feeling.
Okay, so this structural shift we've been mapping out, it obviously has huge tangible consequences for how power is actually executed. You mentioned Camus viewed politics as a kind of management system for collective insecurity.
Right, not as a stage for abstract ideals, but as a practical tool. But when culture is in the driver's seat, that insecurity gets managed through avoidance and caution, rather than through bold, strategic direction.
And the clearest, most immediate impact of that, according to our sources, is the aggressive short-termization of politics.
It's everywhere. And it's not that political actors suddenly forgot how to think 10 years out. It's that they have lost the window of time they need to make a mistake without facing immediate career-ending consequences.
The pressure must be immense. In a cultural environment where outrage can ignite and just consume your reputation overnight, politics learns this very hard, pragmatic reflex.
The reflex is never go first, never experiment, and certainly never, ever touch a necessary but unpopular policy that hasn't already been thoroughly pre-validated by the cultural consensus.
Politics was designed to handle problems that unfold over decades, right? Climate change, demographic shifts, long-term economic strategy.
The slow burn issues, yet it's now forced to operate almost exclusively as an immediate emotional firefighting mechanism. Decisions are no longer weighed against the question, is this the right policy for 2035?
No, the question is, will this cause a significant negative reaction on the trending charts by tomorrow morning?
And that cultural velocity forces governance into what the sources call an eternal present. And we know from Camus' insights that humans suffer immensely when they're confined to the present, without a hopeful, long-term perspective. Now, that same fate is being applied to our very mechanisms of governance.
The second major impact you see is this profound defensiveness of power. Because culture defines these rigid limits on what can be said, political power just masters the technique of selective silence.
Any opinion, any genuine attempt at a novel or unconventional idea becomes a critical, potentially fatal risk to your political future.
It's not even about whether the idea is good or bad.
No, it's about the timing. Consider a politician who needs to discuss funding for a controversial but necessary infrastructure project. The facts might demand action, but if that politician misses the cultural beat, if the emotional timing is off or the standardized language of the debate is wrong, the defense of the policy will be completely drowned out by the cultural outrage against the tone.
So truth becomes secondary to the moral climate.
It does. Power becomes incredibly adept at reading the wind before it dares to open its mouth. And the inevitable consequence of that extreme defensiveness is the increasing hollowness of political language.
Ideas can't stand on their own merit anymore.
No, they have to be thickly wrapped in this standardized emotional packaging. They have to use symbolic, safe phrases. They have to be engineered to avoid causing shock or offense to the quickly moving cultural consensus.
And Camus had a really profound and troubling warning here. He said that when the language of politics loses the capacity to offend,
when it's designed solely for compliance, it simultaneously loses the capacity to tell the truth. Because truth is often messy, inconvenient, and sometimes offensive to one side or another. Safety is always agreeable, but it's ultimately empty.
The third impact gets into accountability, and this is the problem of delayed formalization. You said culture experiments first, then politics formalizes the outcome later. That sounds responsive on the surface.
It does, but Camus would immediately ask the hard question. Who exactly is accountable when the cultural experiment causes significant unforeseen harm down the line?
Because culture isn't designed for accountability.
Not at all. It's designed for expression. It moves on to the next trend. Politics is the structure we built for accountability, but when it's only following, that responsibility becomes dangerously diffused. It becomes ambiguous.
And Camus warned that when you fundamentally separate action from responsibility, when the state is just stamping approval on what's already happened culturally, society enters its most dangerous historical phase.
Politics ceases to be a place of ethical foresight. It becomes a passive collector of consequences. And when those consequences finally emerge years later as economic instability or social fragmentation, no one is left standing to claim them.
And this erosion of responsibility leads right into the fourth consequence, which is the loss of political trust. People see this happening. They see their leaders constantly surveying the crowd, adjusting their sails to the shifting winds, rather than setting a firm course.
They see caution, but they don't see conviction. And Camus noted that power is inherently mistrusted when it fears solitude. True leadership carries the necessary risk of being misunderstood, of having to stand alone for a difficult or complex truth. Reactionary politics only buys temporary compliance. It never generates deep, resilient trust.
So the accumulating tragedy, the silent cost, is the disappearance of long-term responsibility. When the consequences of these culturally driven short-term decisions emerge years later, culture has moved on, attention has shifted, and the governing emotion has changed entirely. Politics is just left holding the bag.
And that is the tragedy of power in a world without memory. It has all the tools to manage the immediate fire, but it has completely lost the capacity to manage the systemic consequences of our collective, impulsive, short-term cultural desires.
Okay, so this profound inversion we're talking about, culture commanding the moral stage, politics just formalizing the performance, it isn't a simple story of, good versus bad or progress versus decline.
No, it's a massive, necessary paradox. And Camus would insist, as our sources do, that we have to stay in the tension of this paradox. We have to really sit with it and understand it rather than just rushing to a quick judgment.
Because this inversion is understandable, right? It's the natural result of a deep collective fatigue.
A profound weariness with political systems that all through the 20th century kept promising guidance and liberation, but in the end delivered control, disillusionment, and immense pain. The cultural rebellion against that kind of political imposition was, in many ways, historically inevitable.
And on the surface, you can see the gain. Cultural leadership feels like a victory for concrete human experience over these cold, abstract political structures. Previously neglected experiences are illuminated instantly. Silent norms that maybe deserve to be broken are finally questioned and overturned with this incredible cultural velocity.
Absolutely, there's a real and necessary gain there. But here is the crucial, difficult question the sources raise. If no one is willing to assume responsibility for the long-term, slow direction of society, who ultimately bears the crushing weight of all these instantaneous, powerful, but fleeting emotions, the risk is existential because accountability just vanishes.
Culture operates brilliantly on intensity, but it's structurally incapable of providing durability.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's excellent at exposing injustice, at starting conversations, at breaking down old, rigid structures. But culture cannot sustain the difficult, contradictory, slow work of governance, of maintenance, of preservation.
And politics, in its ideal role, is supposed to be the preserver, the holder of those difficult, long-term truths and frameworks that culture touches, illuminates, and then quickly abandons for the next thing.
And when politics surrenders that preserving role to simply follow the cultural crowd, no one is left to perform the hardest job of all, translating raw, powerful emotion into accountable, enduring responsibility.
This brings us back to Camus' really demanding definition of freedom. He would say freedom isn't just the right to feel outrage and react to injustice.
No, it's the difficult, heavy willingness to take enduring responsibility for the consequences of that reaction.
And our current order allows for incredibly rapid, satisfying declarations. The instant outrage, the clear separation into us and them, but it almost never demands long-term accountability for where that stance leads.
And politics, by only following the cultural mandate, becomes the passive collector of those eventual structural consequences. When the result is uncomfortable or painful years later, the cultural crowd has already moved on.
The sources insist this isn't a sign of moral decay. It's a collective maturity test for our whole society.
The question isn't who leads whom anymore. The question is whether anyone, be it a system or an individual, has the patience and the fortitude to truly lead at all, or if we just prefer the ease of constantly reacting.
Camus would never advocate for returning to an age of political imposition, but he deeply distrusted a world where ultimate meaning is determined solely by these temporary emotional climates. He gave this state of affairs a chilling name.
Freedom without memory.
And that kind of freedom is deeply seductive, isn't it? It lets you rapidly shift your moral stance without guilt. You can shed yesterday's ethical responsibility and just immediately adopt today's righteous position. There's no need for an apology or explanation. It offers constant immediate moral release.
But a society that loses its moral memory is destined to repeat its mistakes, and with increasing speed because the foundation is always shifting. If all our norms, social, moral, political, are decided by the current cultural beat, who will protect the complex, enduring values whose true meaning is only revealed after years of quiet, often unpopular, endurance?
Politics, at its best, exists to provide that resistance to the short-termism of culture. By being afraid to lead and only reacting, society enters this dangerously fragile state where everything can be questioned instantly, but very little can be retained as a stable foundation for the future.
The accumulated cost of all this isn't immediate chaos. It's a profound, subtle fatigue. A fatigue that comes from a state where no one is willing to take genuine responsibility for consequences that stretch beyond the current emotional news cycle. The freedom we've achieved is exhilarating, but it's a freedom that forgets where it came from and, critically, loses sight of where it's going.
So after all this analysis, our sources, drawing on Camus, they don't conclude with some blueprint for a new political system. They don't offer a 5-point plan.
No, they conclude with a demanding instruction for the individual, a necessary internal stance, not an external system. They recognize that asking politics to just go back to leading or asking culture to step down is, well, it's an exercise in futility at this point.
The promised land in this inverted world is actually something small, private, and immensely difficult.
It's the individual task of learning to live fully and responsibly, even when no overarching structure, neither politics nor culture, is providing clear, consistent leadership or guaranteed moral certainty.
In this age, we are just barraged by these intense emotional commands from the culture. You must speak up, your silence is violence, you must declare your allegiance. But the sources are crystal clear on this existential difference. Reaction is not responsibility.
And that is such a critical distinction. Responsibility, the enduring, difficult kind, it only begins the moment the emotional high of the reaction subsides. It begins when we remain committed to a difficult decision or a moral stance, even after the crowd has moved on to the next urgent outrage, or when our position has suddenly become deeply unpopular.
And this demands that we relearn a specific ancient human capacity that the modern world of instant social validation has actively discouraged.
The ability to endure moral solitude.
Let's define that. Moral solitude is not the physical solitude of being alone.
No, it's the deep isolation that comes from having no crowd, no online consensus, and no formalized structure to guarantee that your position is the right one. You are forced to stand on your internal judgment alone, knowing full well you could be wrong, but refusing to lie to yourself for the sake of belonging.
Camus suggested that the true rebel in this kind of world isn't the loudest shouter on social media.
No, the true rebel is the one who refuses to betray their internal moral compass, even when silence or enthusiastic agreement with the prevailing cultural climate would offer immense professional or social safety.
That requires a quiet, demanding internal integrity. The sources frame it as a loyalty to human limits.
Which means not claiming you possess the absolute, undeniable truth, but also refusing to hand over all of your moral judgment to the prevailing emotional climate of the day. It's a position of patient, humble endurance.
And we have to make this crucial, actionable distinction for ourselves. Culture is excellent at helping us feel the urgency of a problem. It's great at shining a necessary light on injustice.
But we, as conscious individuals, must bear the full responsibility for how we act on that powerful feeling. No cultural trend, no political structure can perform that transformation from feeling to accountable action for us.
And this leads to the humbling realization that every single one of us in this inverted world has to be acutely responsible for what we legalize, either through our silence or through our overly enthusiastic assent.
Because in a world where politics is just following culture, your silent approval of a destructive trend is no longer harmless passivity. It's an active, structural form of empowerment.
So the promised land isn't a state where ethical things become clearer.
No, it's where we become acutely and sometimes painfully aware of the price of ambiguity. Freedom in this age doesn't liberate us from responsibility. It binds us tighter to it than ever before, precisely because no external system is there to take the blame.
And that awareness is where true existential maturity begins. The daunting realization that you're not just a consumer of political or cultural meaning, you're an active, silent participant in its creation, whether you like it or not.
And the final, profound question Camus leaves us with, a question of pure personal accountability, is this. If no system is truly leading the way, dare we live as if every small, seemingly insignificant choice we make today is silently shaping the world we will all be forced to endure tomorrow. He didn't promise that choosing internal integrity would be rewarded, but he said that facing that personal responsibility is the only way not to become an accomplice to the absurd reality we're living in. Hashtag synthesis and final thought.
We have covered a tremendous amount of philosophical ground today, really analyzing this powerful existential inversion. I think the core takeaway, which explains so much of our current societal tension, is that politics surrendered its role as the primary source of meaning.
And it did so largely because the grand collective promises of the 20th century ultimately failed and in many cases crushed individual lives.
Culture has moved right into that deep vacuum, not to govern legally, but to provide what politics couldn't: immediate existential recognition, identity, and a profound sense of belonging.
And this creates that volatile emotional climate that political power must now follow, forcing politics into a purely reactive, short-term, and defensive stance.
So the key takeaways for you, the listener, I think are threefold. First, the leadership role has inverted. Culture creates the immediate moral atmosphere and emotional consensus. Politics just formalizes it later on.
Second, the fundamental human drive we're seeing today is for existential recognition, that feeling of being seen and validated in your unique experience, not just for a political order or economic efficiency.
And third, the greatest personal challenge this shift creates is resisting the rapid, cyclical demands of the cultural climate and cultivating moral solitude, that difficult, necessary ability to stand by your own judgment and conviction even when the immediate crowd shifts decisively against you.
And the sources leave us with this final, challenging thought that is just so relevant to how we participate in public life today. Freedom in this age isn't the easy freedom to react according to the instantaneous emotional climate of the crowd.
It's the much harder, more daring act of taking responsibility for what we choose to legalize, even if it's only through our silent approval, in a world where no external system stands ready to lead with moral conviction.
So the question to leave you with is a personal one. What silent approvals of cultural norms, of generalized outrage, or of systemic short-termism are you granting right now that will silently shape the political and moral foundation of the next decade?
It's a question of profound and unavoidable personal accountability. We'll leave you to ponder that, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.